Hello and welcome to another LightningJS with Solid video. This video is going to be the first of a multi-video series to go through how to build the TMDB app. And in this part, I want to talk about the API, making API calls and manipulating the data and getting it to the UI with Solid. So in order to walk through this example, we're going to be using the Solid demo. And here is the TMDB example in the Solid demo app. And a lot of people probably are building something similar to this, which is like a TV app that is making API calls for rows of data. So we have rows of data, we have a column with lots of different rows, and each of these is displaying different information. There could be different row types. So here we have poster with title, we have a hero, we have a featured row at the top, which doesn't have titles at the bottom. But you get the picture. There's all this different data that we got to get into our UI, and then we can display it and render it. So let's walk through how this page is actually made. And to start, we use the TMDB API. So for those who aren't familiar, it's a free-ish. You have to sign up for an API key, but you can make API calls and get data back and use it to create these sample apps. So that is what I'm using for the Solid demo app. And now we're going to dive into the code. So I have Visual Studio Code open. I already have the app downloaded and open. And I will have the link in the description. So to start, I'm going to start in the index file. And the first thing is the route to the TMDB page. So there's the component. This ties the component to the data source. And what I really like about the SolidJS router is it offers you this ability to preload your data separately from your UI component. And then it gets passed into the page via props. And the benefit of this is you can navigate to your page, and while you navigate to your page, API calls are going to be made at the same time. So it gets your data at the same time that it's rendering the component. So it's going to be a lot faster because you don't have to wait till you navigate to the page to then start making API calls, which is definitely a bit slower. It also separates out your concerns, so you can test your API calls separately from your UI. And you can also at any point, like if you wanted to test different versions of your page, like you can just render TMDB and set data equal to whatever value you want and test your TMDB page with different values of whatever you're passing in. So that's kind of the two great benefits of this preload. There's also an additional one, which is you can call preload from different links. So you can actually pre-request your data for the page before the user even navigates to there. So all kinds of things for performance. But let's dive into how this actually works. And I'm going to start with the actual component. So here is the page. And again, like I said, we have the TMDB page and we're getting props. And these props are going to pass in the data from our preload function. And just to see what that looks like, I'm going to go back to the browser. I'm going to inspect here. And I'm going to go into my sources, which I have my TMDB page app. I set a breakpoint here by clicking here. And just so you know, you can do Control P or Command P and then type in the name of your file, and that will quickly open it. So that's a little shortcut tip for you. But here we set a breakpoint. I'm going to reload. And now we're going to get props, and we're going to see a few different params with this object, or a few different things on this object. The first thing is there's location and params, and those are being passed in by the router. So this just gives you information about what page you're on, are there any query params being added, etc. And then data is the return of our preload data function. So this is whatever that function is going to return. And right now I have it returning an object. You can have any different amount of keys or anything else you want in this object, but it's completely up to you what is in here. And so right now I just have an array of 7 items that have our different popular movies. It has the height of the row, what type of images to display. So poster was one. We saw this hero type as another. And again, here are our items. So right now, items is just this read signal. So this is actually SolidJS's create signal. It's just a read for items because we don't actually have the items yet. And that's going to be a very important thing that we're going to cover is we're returning the rows. And in some cases, you might not have the rows right when you load. You might make an API call to get the rows, which you can completely do. But in our case, we have the rows kind of hard-coded, and we're getting the items asynchronously. And we're going to go through how that works. So that's understanding the data and it being passed into the TMDB. And how that works is this TMDB data function here. So this is our file. And again, what I really like about this is all of our API calls are separate from our UI. So in this file, you could have someone just working on the JavaScript, making API calls, manipulating the data, and getting the data ready for the UI without it actually touching the UI. This is great for decoupling, great for separation of concerns. And here is our TMDB data function. So this is the function that gets called in our router. And we create a rows, an array, and we are just pushing in the objects, popular movies, items. I'm going to go through createResource in a second, but here we have all of our different rows, and then eventually we just have a return. And this is returning an object. And again, you can return whatever you want, and whatever you return here is what props.data is set to. And in our case, it's an object. I recommend that you always make it an object. And then you can have multiple different parameters. You can change it whenever you want, but an object is the most useful. So then what we have here is we have rows with hard-coded data, but then the unique part here, the asynchronous part, is this createResource, fetch popular for movie. What is happening here? And fetch popular, when you make an API call in a browser, you're going to use fetch. Fetch is the way that we make API calls. It gets a network response and returns a promise for that network response. Now, I don't want to go into too many details on what is a promise, what is async and await, how to use those things. There are plenty of articles about them, but essentially, whenever you make a fetch request, it returns a promise, which then gives you this .then chain that you can use, or you can do await for the result of the promise, and then use it synchronously. But both of those are up to you. Additionally, I am using fetch directly. I am not using a library, so we'll actually step into fetch popular real quick. So this is calling API.get, and the path to API.get, just so that we can see what's actually happening here, is we will open up the index in API. This is my whole API, my whole backend, all the fetch stuff. API.get is just calling fetch, setting the base path, so I don't have to pass in the TMDB base URL every single time. It's setting authorization headers, it's getting the result from the fetch request, and it's converting it to JSON. That is all the fetch is doing. This is pretty standard stuff. This is like 44 lines, API call, returning responses. And so let's actually take a moment to go back into the browser and look at this. So here's another thing that we can do is we can remove this breakpoint, we can reload, we can go into our network. And I have this filtered here API for API, which is our URL for api.themoviedb. And it will show me all the calls that are happening for TMDB and any files that have API in the name of it. And one important thing to understand is CORS. So a lot of people struggle with this. Is CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing. By default, when you work in a browser environment, you can make calls to the same domain that your application is on, www.example.com. But if you try to call a different domain, it will block you. It will do this CORS request, which that's this pre-flight, and you'll see an options header. And that's being sent to the API to say, hey, can this URL make this API call? And so it's going to receive this options request, and then you have to return access control allow origin. And this TMDB is returning star, which is saying any origin is allowed to call this API and use this data. So if you have trouble and you get a CORS error, this is the thing. It's your server that needs to be updated to support CORS. Okay, so that was one piece. And now we're making all these calls to API. We can see here's our popular call. And we can actually click on preview here. We can see the results that are returned. We can see the raw data. And we can be like, this is great. So now we can see the raw data, and then we can manipulate it back in the UI side, once we get this data back. But this is returning 20 different items, and we're calling for popular. We're calling different movies with different genres. And you'll also notice that there are 2 requests happening for every one. So again, this is our options request. So it's options saying, do I have permission? And then, yes, I have permission, making the actual call, which then we can click on the preview to see, what is the data that we're getting back from here. Okay, so diving back into Visual Studio Code, we are making these calls, we are getting the results, and here you can do whatever you want with the API. I highly recommend that you try not to change the data as much as possible. Like, try to leave it alone, because you don't have the bandwidth on these devices to actually loop through everything, manipulate it, rename all the keys, do additional filtering. Like, you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. And you need to talk to your middleware team and say, hey, can you change this data source to be more in line with what I actually need? That's one pro tip. Okay, so again, now we get back into here. This is the important thing that's happening is, well, not in that one. We are setting items equal to createResource with calling fetch popular with movie, and then this sub-zero. What is happening here? So hopefully everyone is familiar with createSignal. createSignal is kind of the basic building block of how SolidJS works. It is all about reactivity, and createSignal gives you a variable like count, and then a setter for that variable. And this way, anybody who reads the count variable will be notified when setCount is called. So it gives you your fundamental building block of reactivity. And what createResource does is it essentially createSignal, but instead of taking a raw value, is it takes a promise and it returns a signal that is the value of the resolved promise. Give that a moment to sink in. But again, so fetch data is a function that's going to return a promise. createResource is waiting for that promise to resolve and setting data to be a signal that is the resolved value of fetch data. So I'm going to explain it another way by actually writing the code of what that would mean. So if I did const items, set items, createSignal, and then we did fetch popular movie dot then set items. That's actually correct. So that's great. So that is exactly what createResource is doing. Is rather than having to do these two lines, is it does it all in once. And again, this returns an array, and the first argument of that array is the items. Okay, so hopefully that explains it well. And then I'm going to disable Codium for a few minutes. News. And so now what's happening is we are passing our rows into the UI, and items is a signal. And that's a very important concept to understand, because you don't want to do this, which is rows.push empty array or undefined for items, and then later you get the data back. Let's say you later get the data back for fetch popular, and then you try to do fetch popular dot items dot then set row sub-zero dot items equal to data. Let me fix this up real quick. So if you tried to do this, it wouldn't work. It would work in the sense that items would be set equal to this value, but SolidJS would not update anything on the UI because this is not a signal. SolidJS does not know that you changed items. And that is why it's very important to do this, or to make all the items signals, so that way when you change it, SolidJS knows that it has to update the UI because that value changed. The other important thing to note is you don't have to rechange all of rows. You'll actually notice that rows is not a signal, because I am never going to change rows. I'm changing sub values of rows, but not rows itself. So you only need to make signals for data that's actually going to change as well. And you can make it signals for items that you are going to be changing later on, or will be a value at some point. Okay, and with that, we're almost at a good breaking point. I'm going to again step into TMDB and kind of show this to the point where we have props coming in. And then how is props.data used here? Props.data.rows. So this is being passed in a lazy app. We're going to talk about that in the next video. But this is our array, and that array is synchronous, meaning we have it as soon as the page loads, but we don't have items yet. So this each here is actually not going to render anything until items resolves. So let's see if we can actually go into this TMDB again. Let's open up our sources. And this is one of the things that I really love about Solid is that anytime I can go in here, I can set a breakpoint. And this is my first time doing it. So we get a breakpoint here and we can say, what is row? Row is this, row.title, best Western. And now we can say, what is row.items? And row.items is not even a function at this point, which is kind of strange. But row.items is empty. Like there's nothing there yet. And it's not until it populates, so you see it breaks again. And so now if I do row.items, I probably can't do it inside of here. I probably got to go a step deeper, which is probably in this point. You can actually set a breakpoint on the inner portion of this rather than the outer portion. And let's see, now we can probably do gotta do row.items. So now we see row.items is the resolved array of the items that we've manipulated. Okay. So in the next video, we're going to go through how all of the UI now is taking this data and displaying. But hopefully that was a good intro for how to make API calls, how this data is happening. But it's all simple arrays and objects and using signals. Hopefully you like this. Please like the video. Add comments for ideas for new videos, for things that you want to learn about. But I'm happy to create more videos to help explain things. And if you need a more complicated fetch library, I don't know if I mentioned Axios, but Axios is a great one that gives you a lot more complicated fetch handling so that you can do caching. It does retries automatically. It can intercept requests. It does a whole bunch of things. So if you have a really complicated API, check out Axios. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.